genre stuff. He's doing a lot of Japanese cinema, westerns, comic books. He read a lot of comic books, and he clearly is influenced by the Marvel style way back then, way before it became much more popular. But not a lot of attention is paid to the other half. Of course, people know Kurosawa. That's probably the one name that people are sort of some way aware of. But they're not aware of the more documentaries, like, or Jordan Belson, this very experimental filmmaker. Because, again, we have to remember that even though George didn't grow up in San Francisco, he's influenced by that very avant-garde kind of filmmaking. And there's even a genetic link because David Lynch was almost supposed to do Return of the Jedi. And Lynch wasn't even unsympathetic, but apparently he was very sick that very day that Lucas wanted to speak with him, and so he just had a huge headache. But, he was very nice, and they both, presumably are still on good terms, but he just said, no, George, this is your thing, let me do my thing, you'll do your thing. And he, infamously, he went on to do Dune, which is probably one of the worst films of all time, so it's one of those weird cosmic coincidences. If he had done Return of the Jedi, human history would have been completely different. And of course, you've seen some of the other videos I've been defending TLJ on artistic grounds. I'm not saying necessarily that makes for a good film. I'm just saying that there are undeniably a lot of artistic ambitions just with Phantom Menace. It's just this weird melding of his love of the old serials, which people are well aware of, like Flash Gordon. But he is trying to mix it with this very weird Godard, Truffaut, French New Wave influence in the way that you don't have to have an explicit narrative. You don't need characters. You don't need even a straightforward linear narrative. And when some other people do it, like Christopher Nolan or Tarantino or Kubrick, they play with time, they play with your expectations. People are like, wow, these people are cutting edge. These people have done something completely brand new in cinema. And anybody who really knows film history knows, well, they're really just stealing it from this person or that person. Almost virtually every film that these people do is like really that, well, that's just really stealing from this other person. So, for instance, Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs really just is Stanley Kubrick's The Killing. And at least to Tarantino's credit, he does say this very explicitly. And Kubrick as well, if you look at his films very closely, he's very influenced by French filmmakers. But there's a common root here that there's this mixing of the documentary style with these much more generic styles that people are more aware of, like sci-fi, horror, the Western, romance, musicals. You go through the list and they're just blending and mixing so many different influences. It's hard to tell the exact person or exact school of thought that they're entirely influenced by. And Lucas is pretty much that school of thought in Phantom Menace, where he keeps favoring, composition, narrative, in terms of action, in terms of body language. There's not much narrative in terms of plot or even dialogue. He's always been very clear he does not like plot. He does not like dialogue. He does not like writing. He's not a writer. He was attracted to filmmaking from the editing side. So if you look at Phantom Menace, what's really noticeable is it has a very musical kind of rhythmic pattern, but it doesn't make sense in terms of the plot. So of course he's being attacked all the time by Red Letter Media, Chris Stuckman, and people like that, and saying that, well, I don't quite know what's going on. It seems like there's a bunch of plot holes. You're not being very consistent, etc., etc. But they're not looking at the actual film. And what's interesting is if they did, they'd actually have a stronger argument, noting that it's not just other filmmakers, but like, other auteur directors. He keeps quoting himself. There's a huge amount of his own experimental work that he did in the 60s. Probably the one that people somewhat are aware of is 1138, TH1138. That was actually a student film, but with Francis Ford Coppola, he managed to turn it into a full-fledged feature film, but it was a huge flop. And in fact, even after Star Wars became a huge hit, they re-released it, and it was still a flop. And the studio took it away from him. They cut it out. They took away like 5 minutes. He restored it. But no matter what version they put out, it just didn't really catch on with audiences because, again, this is the Phantom Menace. It's just a lot of visuals. You have to pay attention to what, very small eye movements. You just have to let the editing do the work. It's not based on what the explicit narrative is. I mean, in both Phantom Menace and THX, the message is pretty much the same thing. It's the individual facing a system, and the individual should try to be free. It's about how these groups influence one another, whether they're in conflict or they're cooperating. And if you look at the mall sequence especially, that's all poetry. It's not based on narrative. Yes, there's a drama, there's a beginning and end, and Qui-Gon Jinn, dies, and so there's a kind of rhythm, but there's not, any explicit narrative. I mean, there's just this very pure imagery of this, white versus black, the God versus the devil, but it's left to you to interpret, like, well, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy? Because if you just came in blind and looked at the fight, you'd be like, whoa, I don't get it. Like, who am I rooting for? And like, because there's no explicit saying, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy. It's like a Western, right? You have to realize that these are sort of both anti-heroes. They just represent their side, right? The Jedi side and the Sith side. They both are convinced their order is the only one that should survive. If people are caught in the melee or there are civilians who are sacrificed, so be it. And if you look at selected shots, that Western influence and it wouldn't be right to call it moral nihilism, but this kind of like that values are constantly in flex, and who the cowboy is on the side of, is he really a hero? Is he really a villain? Is not really stress. The stress is on style. The stress is on shot composition. The stress is on shadows. The stress is on these very small particular movements of body and eyes, and how this influences the quote-unquote narrative. So anyway, I just wanted to do this very short essay on this very artistic, non-narrational influence in Phantom Menace, and people often wonder, why isn't this working for me? I like so much of it, but so much of it is just alienating, and that's a deliberate thing. He just does not want to do a straightforward narrative. He's always been much more attracted to a tone poem, to non-narrational editing, and just, letting the images and the colors and the composition do all the work. And this is not very radical either. This is all, very much his influence with Kubrick, Godard, Truffaut, Kurosawa, where it's not really the explicit narrative that's attractive. It's what this whole feeling of the film, where it affects you, what he calls pure cinema, right? It's just the movement of colors, people, objects, things. And, it will work for some people and it won't work for others. I mean, again, like experimental film, artistic film is an acquired taste. I think the dilemma is he basically tried to fool people to pay for an experimental film. And, I'm sure privately he was chucking it up because, all these corporations and toy companies paid him a huge amount of money and they didn't realize he basically pulled up Kubrick on them, right? Like Kubrick fooled people to funding 2001, even though 2001 is just basically this very long experimental film. And in my eyes, it's not a very good one, but nobody knew what he was up to. People thought, oh, this is a space film, right? It's like, no, it's a myth film. It's a religious film. It's really a documentary, and that's what Phantom Menace is. It's a mythical documentary. That's the style it's trying to do. And of course, if you're not into documentaries or into mythic films or experimental films, you're going to be like, well, this is terrible. This is horrible. This is not the Star Wars I wanted or I grew up with. And the answer is, yes, it is. The only difference is that the original Star Wars had all those influences, but he was constrained. He needed money. He's always been very clear. He needed money. He did make Star Wars much more commercial, much more accessible to the public, but those were never his instincts. He would have preferred doing something much more radical, like telling the whole story from the droid perspective. Let's just talk about how 3CPO and R2-D2 see the war and how it is from their perspective. But of course, we know infamously this basically became the Luke Skywalker saga. But that was never the original plan. If he had the money, he would have tried to do something like that. And of course, we all know what probably would have happened. He would have a huge backlash. So I'm going to move on to the sequels, but I just wanted to do this very short essay on the very artistic influences and Phantom Menace. I'm not necessarily saying that makes it a good film. I'm just saying that if you are not understanding the film, you have to understand it's from that angle. It's from this very art school, independent school, avant-garde angle, and that's perhaps why it isn't totally meshing with your experiences.